Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the World Affairs Forum monthly speaker series. My name is Wendy Scratt and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Forum. I want to thank you for joining us today, for taking the time to be a part of our effort to increase awareness of global affairs. Your voice, your contribution to these conversations makes a real difference. I also want to say thank you to our members who are tuning in today for your ongoing financial support in particular, as well as your added voice to the conversation. We do need your financial help to continue creating this programming. Onto our program today, we are honored to introduce you to Colonel Suzanne Nielsen, Professor of Political Science at United States Military Academy, West Point. She is an intelligence officer by background, and she spent tours in Germany, the Balkans, Korea, and Iraq. She served on the personal staff of the Commanding General Multinational Force Iraq, and she's also been a special assistant to the Commander, U.S. Cyber Command and Director, National Security Agency. Her research interests include change in military organizations, civil-military relations, and cyber policy and strategy. Her most recent book, American National Security, was published in 2018. Colonel Nielsen will begin with an introduction to today's topic, which is All Volunteer Force, U.S. Civil-Military Relations in 2020. And she will be joined in conversation by World Affairs Forum board member, Greg Mills. For those of you who haven't met Greg, Greg is a software engineer at Interactive Brokers in Greenwich, Connecticut, managing cybersecurity and the monitoring of data centers in Asia, North America, and Europe. He is a specialist in game theory and financial modeling, and Greg worked for the United States Cyber Command in Hawaii from 2015 to 2018. Prior to that, he served 2 years with the U.S. Intelligence Command in the Republic of Korea, during which time he achieved fluency in Korean. Greg, I'm going to hand it over to you now. For our audience watching, please submit your questions to the Q&A area, not the chat, the Q&A area. As you are listening to this first half hour, the second half an hour, we're going to be taking your questions and addressing them. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'd also like to thank board member Thomas Krantz, who was integral in helping to plan and execute this talk today. And absolutely, I want to thank you, Colonel Nielsen, for joining us today. You have been working on these topics for a very long time, and we're definitely looking forward to listening to your thoughts on this. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I'm going to turn it over to you for some initial remarks, and then we will engage in a question and answer. I'd like to remind our members that they can submit questions in the group chat so that we can pose those questions. So as they come through, they will be reviewed, and then I'll be able to answer them or ask them for you. With that said, thank you again, Colonel Nielsen, and I'll give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, and thank you to all of you for the opportunity to talk to you today about this important topic, which is American civil-military relations. I really appreciate the way that the theme was pitched to broaden the discussion about what we should want from our civil-military relations beyond the focus solely on civilian control to some other important dimensions of the relationship between this institution and our society, as well as our government. What I wanted to do before I get too far along is just clarify, as I'm sure many of you anticipated, everything I say today is just my personal perspective and should not be taken to be representative of the views of the U.S. Military Academy or the Army or the Department of Defense. And I thought what I might do to open today's session is to share with you a few ideas drawn from a recent article I co-authored on the topic of officer military education. The start point for our analysis of this piece was the idea that military operations undertaken by the United States since the terrorist attacks of September 2001 in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, among other locations, have been more costly and less successful than the United States has anticipated or desired. The reasons for these less than optimal results are undoubtedly numerous and complex. One could say the goals of US military operations have been intrinsically difficult to achieve. It's long been recognized in the security studies field that it is more difficult to provide order where there's a lack of legitimate governance than it can be to defeat enemy armies. In addition, decisions made by our country's elected leaders, the workings of the interagency process, and the actions of multiple departments and agencies of the US government have also contributed to US strategic shortcomings. But so has the US military, and there is now in the military's ranks an opportunity for self-assessment. And our argument in this piece was that as a partial guide to this introspection, leaders of today's military institutions would do well to consult the foundational literature on civil-military relations. For almost 6 decades now, 2 works have been touchstones within this field. Samuel Huntington's The Soldier in the State, which was published in 1957, and Morris Janowitz's The Professional Soldier, which was published in 1950. It is a basic framework from The Soldier in the State that has generally held more sway over officer education. In the current strategic environment, our argument is Janowitz's The Professional Soldier deserves renewed emphasis. The reason is that Janowitz's The Professional Soldier is superior in its articulation of the need for political awareness in the officer corps, placing more emphasis on the need for officers to understand the political impact of military posture at home and around the world, as well as the political impact of military operations. So I just want to make a few minutes of comments, and I'm going to proceed in 4 parts. The first is to just unpack a little bit this idea of strategic success. When I think about this concept, the start point for me is most often the classic work of military theory, Karl von Clausewitz's On War, which was first published in 1832. One of its enduring strengths is its logic and its clarity regarding the relationship between military means and political ends. To see this, one need merely recall Clausewitz's famous formulation, war is merely the continuation of policy by other means. He goes on to say, the political object is the goal, war is the means of reaching it, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. The value of military means depends on their contribution to a more politically desirable peace. The greatest demands on military judgment are felt by the most senior commander in a war. As Clausewitz says, on that level, strategy and policy coalesce. The commander-in-chief is simultaneously a statesman. So it follows that the United States would benefit from having military leaders who are aware of the political ramifications of their presence, action, or inaction, and who are inclined to recognize that their success or failure to advance the national interest will ultimately be judged in political terms. For the second part of the argument, I'd like to just briefly survey the merits and weaknesses of the soldier in the state. It's very rare, actually, for work of political science to endure as Huntington's has. It is still an almost necessary touchstone, almost 60 years after it was first published. It was influential at the time, and it remains influential for several reasons. First of all, at the time, it spoke to serious Cold War concerns about American national security. Secondly, it identified the military as a profession, which was attractive to those within the institution. And third, and finally, it developed a formula for civilian control called objective control. And under objective control, the military would remain politically neutral profession, loyal to whomever attained legitimate political authority, but with the autonomy to develop its expertise in the management of violence. In sum, Huntington argued that Americans could have national security and liberalism, both at the same time, in an enduring standoff with the Soviet Union, if the United States could obtain a pattern of civilian control closest to objective civilian control, closest to objective control. However, in articulating the solution, Huntington stressed the division of labor between the statesman and the soldier. Huntington's military officers spoke only of managing violence. The statesman spoke only of the political objectives. The tricky business of linking one to the other In short, the work of strategy was left without a voice. In contrast then, moving on to part 3, is the political awareness in Janowitz's book, The Professional Soldier. Like Huntington's The Soldier in the State, Janowitz's The Professional Soldier was written in the context of the Cold War. However, while the strategic context was similar, the practical policy concerns of these two authors were very different. Huntington was most concerned about whether the United States could retain a sufficiently effective professional military in the context of American liberalism and an enduring threat. His solution, a politically neutral and powerless military, professional military autonomy in the development of military expertise, and a degree of cultural isolation of that military from the broader society was what would enable that to happen. While Janowitz similarly saw that a strategy of containment would require a large force in being, he argued for integration rather than separation. When military confrontation could escalate to nuclear annihilation, the country would actually need its officer corps to become a constabulary force. In Janowitz's words, this force is one that is continuously prepared to act, committed to the minimum use of force. In other words, a military that seeks viable international relations rather than victory, because it has incorporated a protective military posture. The most significant advantage of Janowitz's constabulary concept when compared to Huntington's ideal of an autonomous professional military is its emphasis on the idea that officers require political awareness to serve the national interest most effectively. Military institutions have a political impact in times of peace as well as in times of war. Janowitz sets out 3 dilemmas in particular that military leaders should help the country's political leaders to address. The first is the political as well as the military implications of force structures. The second is the relative advantages of military and non-military approaches to international security challenges. And the third is international security issues with a military dimension that do not involve the use of force, such as arms control. 14 years after the publication of The Professional Soldier, Janowitz extended the work's analysis of the strategic environment, arguing that the application of force is not a periodic all or nothing event, but instead a continuous aspect of the social process, which must be moderated in terms of self-interest and recognition of the unanticipated consequences of the use of force. So touching briefly on the fourth element of my remarks is really just what are the implications of these things for military education? Samuel Huntington did advocate for broad general education for officers, and then he advocated for a technical phase, and he envisioned this technical phase as being the tactical and technical competence and not explicitly including sensitivity toward political implications. Janowitz, on the other hand, agreed that tactical and technical competence of the officer corps at its warfighting tasks was essential. However, he argued military officers must also understand politics. And here, sitting at the Military Academy, I thought it would be particularly appropriate to share this quote. Officer education in political military affairs should start in the Military Academy, where tactical training must be related to the requirements of international relations and continue at higher levels of education and professional experience. So in conclusion, I opened this presentation as we did our article with a call for introspection. Why have recent US military operations not produced a more satisfactory degree of strategic success? As acknowledged above, the reasons involve many factors that have nothing to do with the education of the US officer corps, at least potentially so. However, to the extent that the military played a role in the country's failure to secure more favorable political outcomes at a lower cost, it seems useful to ask questions such as the following. Is the military too focused on achieving tactical and operational success and not focused enough in helping the country's political leaders develop and implement national security policies that will produce strategic success? And secondly, are today's senior military leaders adequately prepared to help the country's leaders examine the full array of policy options and to assist them in advancing the national interest through means other than the use of force? In my view, it has always been false to suggest a stark trade-off between the tactical and technical competence of officers and the ability of officers to appreciate political impact. Neither alone is satisfactory, and the US military needs both. So in conclusion, I would argue that the 21st century military and its officers can and should be excellent tacticians and astute observers of political affairs. In its call for officers to be aware of the political consequences of military posture and operations, Janowitz's The Professional Soldier remains a useful guide for preparing officers to best contribute to the country's strategic success. So let me leave it there, Greg, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Nielsen, for those remarks, and they were very thought-provoking. I appreciate you posing those questions, because those questions were some of the questions that I also wanted to pose to you. So before we really dig into it, one of the things that I think really comes to the forefront from the civilian perspective in the military and their understanding of civilian military relations is that emphasis on civilian control, which seems non-controversial within the academia. Could you please just touch upon a little bit why it's not controversial in advanced democracies to have civilian control of the armed forces?
Yeah, I actually, I think it's kind of a complicated answer to that. You know, one of the places I actually start is going back even more deeply into military theory for just even a strategic argument for why civilian control makes strategic sense, whether it's a democracy or a non-democracy. And that's really the argument that the military is an instrument and that the military should serve political purposes. And that argument actually transcends context. So, you know, Clausewitz, writing in the context of an autocracy, still believed that it was just a fundamental misunderstanding of strategic affairs to ever believe that even after a war was declared, it would be anything other than guided by political purpose and political leadership. So I think you can root it there. And then I think when you layer on the idea of a liberal democracy, you just reinforce that argument in so many ways, in the sense that the legitimate political authority in the country is, of course, in the US context, designated by the US Constitution. So the important judgment calls are appropriately rest in responsible political officials. And then I would also say just the truth is that there is no important call about military affairs that doesn't have a very significant values component laid on it. It's not really a technical question or a tactical question. Really profound questions like, is a political purpose worth the loss of life, are just not subject at the end of the day to some sort of rigorous systemic or mathematical or expert analysis. It's really a question of the values of the polity, and really in our system of government and advanced democracies, it is only political leaders that can begin to have the legitimate responsibility and authority to make those calls. So those are sort of abstract theoretical reasons. I think practice has reaffirmed it. I think there's a strong culture within military institutions that acknowledges it. And so I think at this point in our history, it's reaffirmed in many ways, but those are just some of the logical arguments I would make up front.
So touching on that differences between military culture and civilian culture, one thing that seems ubiquitous throughout the literature is this acknowledgement in a difference between the cultures of the civilian population and the military population. And the tagline for our talk today is an all-volunteer force. I was hoping to get your thoughts on whether or not the fact that the United States has an all-volunteer force contributes to that divergence or that gap in the cultures of the civilian population and the military population, as opposed to countries like Germany or South Korea, where government civil service or military service is mandatory for at least some portion of the population.
I do think, well, I wonder if I could just give sort of a two-part answer. The first part would be, should we care about whether or not there is a gap? And, you know, in my perspective, from my perspective, there are some functional demands associated with capable military organizations that raise to the fore values that may not be dominant in the broader culture. So, for example, a focus on obedience. I mean, we are basically an obedience driven organization, and obedience has a role in the broader American society, but is not a first and foremost value. And I think in some ways is inconsistent with some of our core values in terms of prizing individual liberty and moral autonomy above all else. So I think there are some aspects of perhaps norms and values and culture that are legitimately different because they relate to the functions of military service. Other differences in culture, I'm not sure that I would see as particularly desirable. And I do think the all-volunteer force has a tendency to contribute in the sense that the U.S. military is also driven a little bit by cost-benefit calculations on where it invests in its recruitment, and there's several ways in which where it recruits is not fully representative. So the U.S. military is more middle class, less at the highest end, less at the lowest end because of challenges meeting health and education and other socioeconomic preconditions of service, a high school degree. It's also not fully representative among various minority communities, in some cases for some very profound and real historical reasons associated with the disadvantaged status of minorities in the country, and some of that is carried over into the armed forces. So I do think the all-volunteer force, because of the fact that basically the people who serve are those who could be attracted to serve, does tend to contribute to a values gap associated with not being fully representative.
Thank you for that. I think it's worth noting also that while the U.S. military is usually an all-volunteer force, there have been periods, most notably World War II and Vietnam, where we have had conscription. And I'm wondering if there are lasting effects, maybe after periods of conscription, where the force becomes more representative and diverse, and then starts to transition back toward self-selecting a type of personality or a type of person or socioeconomic class into military service. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that in terms of whether or not there is sort of an enduring effect for having been a conscript force. You know, I think that's possible. You know, I also think it's possible to, you know, one thing about an obedience-based organization, it is possible to make and implement change in areas of concern. So I don't also view any cultural gaps or any differences in views as some sort of concrete, fixed fact that we have to take for granted rather than be cognizant of and even address if we were to view it as a concern. So I think what you say is plausible, Greg. I hadn't really thought a lot about it, but I do think it's plausible that sort of the experience of common service could shape the military's culture in times that endure beyond the service, and that an all-professional military could harden in a bit of a distinct culture over decades. I think that's very plausible.
Well, let me pull on that obedience thread a little bit. Throughout the literature, one of the things that is very common is the characterization of the military culture as being more conservative than the general population. Why do you think that is, considering that in a lot of areas, specifically in equal opportunity, which regards to providing equal opportunities to service members regardless of their race, religion, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, most recently, I believe. Why are those things seemingly more progressive and seem to happen before the general population takes it, makes those changes, while also the military seemingly having a more conservative cultural bias than the general population.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. My own view is that in general, one ought to expect the services and the military institutions to be conservative in the sense that experimentation is viewed with great dubiousness, because the thought is that the cost is potentially so high that it is, we really need to focus on military effectiveness and military efficacy and take care with experimentation, particularly for social purposes, if we're uncertain about the outcome, such that we're not rolling the die the next time we go into conflict. So I think actually the armed services tend to be a bit conservative. So how do we understand the fact that one could argue that there have been periods in our history where the services have been relatively more egalitarian and provided opportunities for minorities and perhaps for women that exceeded those available in society? And I think that actually gets at the obedience issue in a way that I'm not sure is where you were headed with using the word in this context, but I do think that once the policy framework is in effect, the military does have the ability to implement and to ensure implementation of policies. For example, I think the integration of African Americans into the armed forces was really fundamentally took most root after a political directive that was sort of reaffirmed by the demands of the Korean War in terms of what was needed in order to be effective. Just as I think that the integration of women and the opportunities for women in the services were really driven by the broader society and then embraced most fully by the Army when it was concerned. And I say the Army because it was the most affected by the transition to an all-volunteer force, by the need to be sure that it was going to attract sufficiently talented people in sufficient numbers to meet all the requirements. And so the Army became a little bit more open-minded to evaluating where women could serve and contribute. So I don't think particularly military organizations or institutions are by their nature progressive, but I do think they have the potential to reflect some of our high values when it comes to equal opportunity because of the fact that we have good accountability. In general, we have the ability to implement and to enforce implementation and to hopefully to police up problems where they occur.
In your opening remarks, you talked about the need for officer education when it comes to the political ramifications or impacts that might happen as a result of their implementing a specific strategy or at the lower levels, a specific tactic in our national defense. I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about how the necessary education could be, because we have them at the military academies, but to what extent do they also translate into the ROTC programs or the OCS programs for officer training, as well as some of the more senior enlisted positions, which lately more and more have this requirement for, maybe not a hard requirement, but a soft encouragement to have attained civilian education at the college level or above.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think there's sort of two potential parts of that. I think one is the sort of educational experience, and one might easily look at the military is actually very good to its employees in the sense of offering continuing professional education at the various levels. And so one question might be, at what level do we think that these types of considerations ought to get some coverage? And I wouldn't want to say that they aren't covered at all. So for example, at the Academy, we have a capstone course called Officership. And certainly the relationship of the officer and the Army to the state is talked about there. And part of that is certainly reaffirmation of this culture of subordination, but all this also understanding of political context. But in general, as military careers advance, particularly in the branches. And again, I'll speak mostly to my service because I know it best. What tends to be prized are very tactical and operational assignments, and what one can undertake at some risk, but it is at some risk, and then needs to reintegrate from are broader educational opportunities and experiences. And so one might look at what is offered in the professional military education curricula at some levels, and one might also look at the opportunities for broadening experiences, whether it be formal education or whether it be the opportunity to work in the interagency. There's a very small training with industry program that might be relevant in some contexts, but just sort of this notion as being sort of acceptable and a little bit more to the center and a little less to the fringe, that what we also really need to understand is political context, and that we can't assume A, that only generals need that, or B, that somehow magically when you go from being a colonel to a general, it somehow is given to you by virtue of making that transition, rather than something that you have built and cultivated over the course of a career. So I think that's how I might think about it.
So along those lines, you made a reference to the coalescence of policy and strategy at some of the most senior levels. And it appears that while people are wearing the uniform, there is usually a very strong understanding that political commentary is discouraged, and the job of the military is as an advisor to the civilian leadership. However, it's fairly common for officers after retiring from the military to then begin commenting on politics. Now, I'm wondering how you think that the, for lack of a better term, the self-imposed and then sometimes policy-imposed muzzle on active duty advisors in making political commentary might actually hamper the political strategy necessary to achieve national defense. And if you could make any commentary on whether or not you think generals or people at the advisor levels should be able to speak more or less, that would be great as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, Greg. I think my perspective on that would be that it's a pretty good rule in general to speak up but not speak out. And so what I would hope is that there was fairly vigorous debate surrounding a president to enable the president to really face tried and true possibilities or ideas or options, and that no one held back out of a sense of their lane or their box in trying to put all the factors and to troubleshoot and offer thoughts about second and third order effects. Ask about, that critical strategy question, which is, well, let's say we achieve that, what next? What follows? How do we end in a good place? So I think that the role of the active duty military ought to be to try to be partners in a vigorous dialogue, recognizing that the duly elected political leaders are ultimately in charge, but that dialogue is critical to policy, and to see themselves as having a responsibility to say things that are a little bit undesirable because they point out potential problems, and they complicate the strategic decision, and they enhance the awareness of risk. So I think speaking up is critical. I think another struggle that we have in our system is that the president and Congress are co-equal in military affairs. And so Congress has a very legitimate right to exercise oversight, not based on a right that's bestowed by the president, but that's separately given to Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, such that the military really owes forthright advice to the elected political leaders in Congress as well. So a real trick in our system is, how does one loyally fulfill obligations to both institutions of Congress without impinging inappropriately on the president's ability to gain the benefit of confidential and vigorous advice. So it's a little bit perhaps hard to realize in practice, but I think speak up but not speak out is how I would start with that.
It sounds like a pretty complex balancing act. I have a question from our audience. How could military leaders be more public in sharing their thoughts on strategic trade-offs without appearing to move the civil-military balance? And I think that that segues nicely from the question we just asked.
Yeah, no, I really think it does, because I do think that deference for somebody like our elected political leaders and perhaps especially the president as commander in chief is such that that vetting of options, that the president ought to have the prerogative, in my view, to do that behind closed doors. But I really think that that the responsibility to try to enable the American people to have more awareness rests in our political leaders. So it does rest in what we expect of the president and potentially some members of his cabinet in terms of what they would disclose. But frankly, it also rests in the scrutiny provided by Congress. Congress, the president can't do anything unless Congress pays for it. And so, and Congress also is the one with the authority to raise and maintain armies, to maintain a navy. So Congress has very significant prerogatives, and also even with regard to foreign affairs and with oversight. And so, I think for many in Congress, undertaking those kinds of tasks is similar to their work in foreign affairs, which is closer to pro bono work rather than constituent service. So, you have to look at the incentives of members and what would make them more likely to provide that scrutiny. But I would think that it would be our elected political leaders that need to help to make the electorate aware rather than to have sort of an unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy within the U.S. government speaking directly to the American people.
Our second question prefaces by saying, full disclosure, it's from a former U.S. Foreign Service officer, and it is, would political and military success be enhanced by stronger non-military agencies to set an overall context of policy and means to policy ends? For example, a diplomatic service fully steeped in thinking of overall national interest and literate in military as well as political and economic and even cultural matters.
1,000% yes. 1,000,000% yes. I mean, I completely agree with that. It's very dismaying to me to see us divest in things like our capability to conduct foreign affairs without the use of force, our capability to advance U.S. interests through things like development assistance. I mean, USAID has kind of been reduced to a contracting agency, and I mean, across the board with regard to information, I think absolutely the interests of the United States in the world should be advanced on a daily basis by instruments other than the military instrument of power. Not that the military can't play a role through posture and through presence, but that fundamentally non-military instruments would make it much less likely that that role would have to become a role that involved the use of force. So, I think Robert Gates has been a true leader on this, with his, as Secretary of Defense, one of the few secretaries of defense to advocate for greater investment in the non-military instruments of power. And I think even his most recent book, the name of it's escaping me right now. What's it called? It might even be called Exercise of Power, is really fundamentally about this topic, about how the United States has disadvantaged itself in terms of advancing its interests in the world by underinvesting in many ways that could advance those interests that are not military. So, thanks for that question. I just 1,000% agree.
The next question is one that I think is probably in the minds of a lot of our members. Outside of civilian leadership, what part can civilians play in supporting or improving relations with the military? And I'd like to tack on something to that that I had thought of before. is it possible to negatively affect national defense policy by supporting the military too much? So we want to improve the way that civilians support civilian military relations, but we also don't want to detriment our national security. Can you please talk about those issues?
Yeah, so let me start here, Greg, and then you can kind of re-steer the question if I'm not hitting on it exactly. But you know, I've long been a little bit had mixed feelings about the typical sort of annual surveys about trust in American institutions and how the U.S. military is off the charts and often at the top of the charts, ahead of things like even small business, certainly organized religion. I mean, the military might be in the 80s while Congress is at 7%, has a great deal of trust or complete trust in it as an institution. And so it gets to your point about, can the military get too much support? And I think if the support is not accompanied by an appreciation or active engagement or knowledge, I don't necessarily think it's good for American national security or for our defense. I think when you don't know an institution very well, and I think that we ought to expect that that's going to be more and more the case as a smaller and smaller percentage of the country serves, I think you can have one of two reactions. One is that I think you could have one of two undesirable reactions. There's a whole host of others, but you could have an irrational fear, sort of this hatred, this fear, this loathing of this thing you don't understand. Or I think you could have over-the-top admiration and respect, when in reality, at the end of the day, it's a large group of human beings. Many things about the military services, as bureaucracies, are frankly, you know, admirable, and I've found it worth devoting a career toward military service. On the other hand, in any large human organization, you're going to have failings unless you build in sufficient mechanisms of accountability, and you know that there is going to be scrutiny. And so I do believe it's possible to have too much support or trust if what that means is an unwillingness to examine carefully or to be critical. So I guess maybe it gets at the first question as well with regard to what can people do. I think people can be invested and aware. And I know that's a really high ask when everybody's got tons going on in their daily lives, but I think that really our country ultimately relies on political accountability, where the voter plays a critical role. And so, you know, I do think individual citizens that don't have any other position being involved in that way is important.
Our next question references some recent events. What are some specific measures that the military could undertake to reinforce the trust factor within civil society, especially after the June event at Lafayette Square? And what, if any, are the lessons that the military has started to draw from that event?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. These have been very difficult times in a variety of ways. Washington, D.C. is sort of a unique area in the sense that it is the only place in the country where the National Guard might be called out to do law enforcement and be at the behest of federal authorities, as opposed to any time that the National Guard is called out by governors. It does have law enforcement authorities, but the governor is in charge, even if the federal government is paying. So it was a particularly tricky context that does get to the heart of civil military relations. I mean, I do think that there is some appreciation for some of the challenges. You know, General Milley, I think, was explicitly came out and offered an apology for appearing in combat uniform OCPs in Lafayette Square with the president for the photo opportunity that was associated with you know, the removal of protesters from Lafayette Square. And so I think there's already reflection about that. And I think it's too soon to say there's organizational lessons learned. But I think there is already reflection. And I guess I would like to give credit, as I understand it, there was some of that dialogue and debate that I had suggested was critical with regard to the idea that the 1807 Insurrection Act might be invoked. I do think that that would be a good example where, again, it's a political leader who has ultimately authority and responsibility, and that person will be held accountable for the choice that they make. But to the extent that there's institutional knowledge, there's history, there's an appreciation of what military forces do well and don't do as well, what they're prepared to do, there absolutely ought to be that vigorous dialogue about the right course of action.
Thank you for that. That's a very, very thoughtful and nuanced response, I think, to a very complex problem. Our next question is, as warfare becomes more technologically complex, how can civilian leadership adapt to craft effective national defense policy? And I think what they're getting at there is that the military, it houses the experts on some of the more complex domains of warfare, and newly elected civilian leadership may not share that expertise. So there may be a knowledge or expertise gap between them. So what are some things that civilian leadership can do that might help bridge that gap? And I'll even expand it to say, what are some things the military can do to help bridge that gap?
Yeah, so that's, I guess perhaps I could address this question by sharing a little bit of my experience working for General Alexander as the commanding general of Cyber Command, in terms of that form of warfare is sort of high-tech warfare at its epitome. It's even labeled by the military as being a separate domain with some very different characteristics than sort of land, sea, air, and space. I think the military, what would we hope for from political leaders? We hope for from political leaders, particularly those who are elected, who may have credentials, experiences, valuable leadership traits that come from pursuits that are other than national security pursuits, that we might hope that they have an aspiration to learn as much as will make them fluent enough to make good decisions, that they would be avid consumers of information and open to understanding a situation and getting advice from really competing voices in the room. And I think the military ought to recognize that it has an obligation, because of its continuity and its professional expertise, to seek to be as forthcoming as possible, and to seek to have those opportunities to share perspective. A good example on securing cyberspace was, even the basic question of what is the military's role. When you think about cyber, it's really owned and operated by private sector operators. There's no commons. There is a large role for the private sector, as well as for the FBI and criminal enforcement, for the Department of Homeland Security in terms of critical infrastructure. And so even being an effective and open collaborator in the interagency process to try to help the federal government sort through roles and missions. That was some of the work, actually, I watched General Alexander be very involved in that year, 2012, 2013, trying to increase the coherence of the US government's approach to the national security challenge. And I would argue there is irreducibly a military role. The military is completely dependent upon its cyber resources in order to have the level of effectiveness that the American people have bought and paid for. So even from the perspective of defense, but also thinking about its association, its relationship to the use of force in the modern world, there is a military role, but I think the military has an obligation to be a good collaborator, because there's a very intensive and important interagency role and private sector role as well. So I don't know if that helped to answer that question, but I think sometimes the military, any organization perhaps, can think about the collaboration part as an afterthought. And I think it might be especially an obligation of the military to put it at the forefront when something is such an intrinsically multi-stakeholder domain as is cyber.
Thank you. I should have known that you would lean more toward the military doing more to help the civilian side, and I think I agree with that because ultimately we have the civilian leadership accountable to the population at every election cycle, and it's not really a continuous accountability with the way that the military is continuously accountable throughout the cycle. In somewhat, it doesn't track with the election cycles the way that political leadership does. Our next question is going all the way back to your doctoral work on civil military relations. Could you please reflect on some of the questions that you tackled in your doctoral thesis, and just sort of comment on whether or not those reactions that you had then have stood the test of time?
So I actually did my doctorate on military change in military organizations, but it is interesting. I started out with actually a civil military relations question, and then I didn't end there. I started out with trying to understand, trying to wade into this great question in the field about the relationship between the characteristics of civil military relations and having effective militaries. And I ended up actually a bit at sea in that space, and I ended up more looking at how do we understand when military organizations transform themselves, what are their characteristics? And so my doctoral dissertation actually looked at the U.S. Army. The primary case or cases actually was the U.S. Army coming out of the Vietnam War. And then in Desert Storm, there was just an incredible amount of positive press about the performance of the U.S. military. And so the contrast between the early 1970s, when it was an army in crisis, and the death of an army, a pre-mortem, those were the names of some of the titles of the books. And then the transformation into this organization that everybody raved about in 90-91 was really the focus of my thesis. How do we understand that transformation? I do think there was a bit of a civil military component to it, in the sense that I did ascribe a role to constructive collaboration among the senior leaders of the Army as an institution, and political leaders in both the executive branch and in Congress, in terms of crafting a way ahead that was agreed upon and that would be sustained because it was done collaboratively. So I do think there was a civil military role in that story, but it didn't end up being at the heart of that story, which was really, mostly in my view, a story about leaders responding constructively to some existential threats, like the loss of a war and the transition to an all-volunteer force, but doing it in such a way that they sort of comprehensively changed some of the characteristics of the organization. So that's actually what I wrote on it for my dissertation, but it did have a civil military component.
I think given that response and your response to the question immediately prior, I definitely see how they thread together, and it's that collaboration piece between the military and the civilians that seems to continue. Up next, I have our last question for you. What is it that the military would most appreciate or most like from the U.S. civilian population when it comes to civil military relations?
You know, I would not be fully truthful if I didn't say that that there is a deep appreciation within the military for the amount of trust. And I think that just makes it more beholden upon the military to feel that, to those in the services at the time, to feel that they have earned that trust. You know, that being said, I do think with regard to citizens writ large, you know, I would still default to being interested and informed. You know, having, I think the U.S. military respects the legitimate political authority and responsibility that is in our political leaders to make the critical decisions about war and peace for our country, how much to invest in national defense, how to use the military. But I think that many people, frankly, do have a sense that they are serving the country writ large, even though the specific orders come from those political leaders. And so I do think a sense of interest, a sense of engagement, even though that produces debate, that produces mixed opinions, I think you might very quickly find that that most military officers, I would even say, would look at a protest and say, that's why we serve, to protect the right for that to happen in our country. So I think even diverse opinions about particularly military operations are part of a constructive debate that might help us to use force most wisely. So I know it's a little bit, it doesn't provide a very concrete, I mean, I do think thoughtful acts of kindness are, at an individual level, are very appreciated, but I really think that that sense that we can be confident that we are acting in the interests of the United States as a democratic system, with the knowledge that American citizens participate in the process, and that the policies at the end of the day will be up to them to judge, because they will hold political leaders accountable through the ballot. That is really what would mean the most to me.
Well, thank you very much for answering that. I think your request that the civil population be interested and informed, very well, perfectly describes the memberships of our organization, the World Affairs Forum. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees who have tuned in to this panel and also paid attention and asked very thoughtful and engaged questions. I'd like to remind everyone listening to keep a lookout in your email, because we are planning to have our Congressional Foreign Policy debate next month in mid-October, and there should be information coming out about that soon. And yes, thank you again, Colonel Nielsen. And Wendy, I'll turn it back to you. And thank you for letting me have this opportunity to have a great conversation with Colonel Nielsen and to field all the questions from our attendees. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Colonel Nielsen. Thank you, Greg Mills. We really, these types of in-depth, nuanced conversations really are missing in general in the broader conversation. So we really appreciate you bringing us this one today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much to the organization, obviously, for this opportunity to talk, but also to all who listened in. And I really appreciate the investment, again, that you're making in the things that are important to our country by being a member of this organization and staying informed. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks. And everybody have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.